children. What is philosophy for children?
It's an approach to education in which the traditional discipline of philosophy is presented in the form of stories for children. And these stories are discussed by the children with the teacher's assistance. And in the process of discussion, the children find out that they can reason better about the problems in the stories, and they make better judgments about these problems. So it's a program that strengthens the reasoning and judgment of elementary school students.
Yeah, I think that studying philosophy in the way that it has been constructed by Dr. Lipman helps children to think out for themselves concepts that permeate all the disciplines that they study in the elementary school curriculum. For example, Matt mentioned just earlier the concept of person, or the concept of fairness, or the concept of truth. These are ideas that are very close to children. They probably don't go through a day of their life when they don't use them. But what they mean is something that they have to figure out for themselves, and then begin to see how those very concepts come up again and again and again in the various disciplines that they study.
Dr. Lipman, how do you see the fragmentation of the curriculum and how it could help the program, how the program could help for this problem?
Well, I think that the phrase fragmentation of the curriculum is an apt one, and it suggests that the various subject areas seem rather isolated to the child and unconnected. I think through philosophy there is a connection as a way of relating these subjects to one another, and philosophy provides the mortar for holding the bricks together of the educational establishment. It's a wonderful way of building bridges from one discipline to another.
It also gives you a chance to perfect the kind of reasoning that not only is appropriate for philosophy, but very often appropriate to think in the other disciplines.
Thinking in accordance with established criteria, standards, principles, rules that have been worked out for thinking, that are thought of either formally or informally as logical. So that if we find people who are unbalanced, for example, they will often be self-destructive, and this is illogical to act in a way that is opposed to your own interests.
But what would be the place for creativity and intuition in that conception of reasoning?
Well, but I think that there again is where you want to strike a balance between critical thinking, which is rule-governed, and creative thinking, which is not rule-governed. But there has to be a balance between the two, because the critical thinking needs creative assumptions to work from. The drawing, the deduction of inferences from assumptions or presuppositions that have been arrived at by independent thinking, creative thinking, and so on. So you need a balance between the two, and not just one or the other.
So both are important?
Both are important.
philosophy has been understood as a very complex discipline. How do you take this to children?
Well, philosophers are engaged in the analysis of concepts, first of all. Philosophers have a reservoir of concepts which they traditionally examine and inquire into. And these are very general concepts that stretch across all disciplines. Like the problem of truth is a problem that's found in any investigation of any kind. The problem of justice is one that's found in law, in government, in political philosophy. Problems of fairness are found in ethics. And philosophers examine issues like this, so why not have children do the same thing, examine concepts which are traditional to philosophical inquiry. Now, it generally turns out that these concepts also involve values. In other words, there's a cognitive and an affective or creative side to these concepts, and the cognitive side is usually the conceptual side, but the other side is the value side. And you see this with something like right or person or friendship or fairness, that they are both values and their concepts at the same time. And so this becomes an approach to values education at the same time that it's a matter of conceptual inquiry. Philosophers are also interested in learning how to reason better. And they want to know what are rules of reasoning, what are principles of reasoning, what kind of inferences are permissible to be drawn. When do you accept the rule and reject an inference, or when do you accept an inference and reject the rule? If there's a problem of consistency between the two of them, what gives and what can remain? So there are problems of the philosopher's investigative judgment as to the relationship between rules and inferences. And children worry about the same thing. They worry about, are there exceptions to rules? Or do you always have to keep a rule? Are there any cases where a rule does not have to be kept? And what justifies an exception? Under what circumstances are you entitled not to obey a rule, if any? And so they want to talk about things of this kind. And if you give them the opportunity to discuss rules and exceptions, you strengthen their judgment. Because then they know what is expected of them in given circumstances, in new circumstances. They begin to understand that life presents them with a variety of situations, and they've got to learn to do what is appropriate to these different situations. And the school can't prepare you for the kinds of unforeseen situations you're going to encounter in life. It's got to strengthen the judgment that they give you in the school, so that whatever the circumstances, whatever the situation you encounter, you will be able to respond in some kind of reasonable way. There are values that are assumed by the program. It is not a value-free approach. There are certain commitments that one has when one begins with philosophical inquiry. You want to be open to all different points of view and to find out what different people in the community are proposing and are defending as their own perspectives. You have to be fair to different points of view and not be intolerant. You have to respect and listen to other people. So these are values that are intrinsic to the philosophical approach, that it is anti-indoctrinational. And it is prepared to keep the inquiry going as long as it possibly can, not to give up, and not to simply stop the inquiry because one, for the moment, can't make any further progress. So it's always a tomorrow when you can find someone who's interested in beginning again with the same discussion. So philosophy makes certain assumptions that we have to benefit by taking our problems seriously and discussing them together and seeing if we can make progress in understanding them and in acting on them. Now, it seems to me that these values that philosophy entails are also fundamental to a democratic society. That it's when we refuse to face our problems in a democratic society that the society is in danger of no longer being democratic. If we refuse to discuss our problems together, refuse to deliberate about them, make judgments about them, and act upon our best understanding, then we are endangering the way of life that we have in the society. I do think that philosophy is the least bad system of society. It's a social organization that we can have. It offers the greatest advantages to the most people.
Democracy?
Democracy. And I think that if we don't try to preserve it, we can only do worse. With all the difficulties that democracy offers us, that the lack of democracy is going to be much worse.
So I'm trying to imagine what would be the difference between what happens in a regular school and what would happen in a classroom where children are working with philosophy for children.
Well, in a regular school, the teacher has a work plan, a set of objectives for the day, lesson plans for the day. The teacher will make assignments to the children to learn certain things, study certain readings, and then the teacher will question the children to discover whether they have remembered what they read and can give back to the teacher what the teacher understands to be the correct answers. It's assumed, therefore, that in traditional education, the purpose of learning is to acquire knowledge, information, that is considered trustworthy and reliable. And the teacher is considered a major source of information, an authority on the matters that are studied in school. And the children are then graded on how well they do in telling the teacher what it is that she expects them to tell her. Now, in a philosophy for children approach, you have a very different mode of pedagogy. Even the seating arrangement is different. Instead of sitting in rows, so that some children are seated behind other children and children are seated behind them, and they all stare at the backs of each other's heads all through the day. The children are seated in a circle so that they can look at each other face to face. And the teacher is considered a facilitator of the discussion that is going to take place, not necessarily a source of authority. The teacher is an authority in the classroom here in terms of teaching methods, pedagogy. It's up to the teacher to decide what is necessary to encourage the inquiry to go further, what is interfering and blocking the inquiry and needs to be overcome. Teachers must often make some decisions to help the inquiry proceed. But by and large, it's the students themselves who engage in the discussion, who ask the questions, not the teacher. It's the students who ask the questions, and they ask them of one another. And they listen to each other's answers, and they try to help each other build on those answers, because these children are dealing with problems and trying to work out hypotheses for solving those problems, and they're trying to work collaboratively, not competitively, but collaboratively on the problems they're facing. Now, how do the problems get set? Well, I had mentioned before that there are novels in the program that the children read. And each day there are episodes from the novel which are taken up. The children read these episodes aloud, a paragraph at a time, so that they all can share in the reading, and they all possess the reading together and the meanings of the reading. They begin by making it a kind of intellectual property of their own. And then they are asked by the teacher what questions they have about the readings. And the teacher puts these questions on the board. And these questions form the agenda of the subsequent discussion. So that it's not the teacher's lesson plan that dictates the agenda, but the students' interests. And according to their interests, they will ask the questions that will be taken up and discussed. And the discussion then ensues based on the questions that the teacher asked, that the students ask, but based on other questions, follow-up questions that the students ask of one another. So they're learning to question, and they're learning to listen, they're learning to speak, they're learning to reason, they're learning to deliberate, they're learning to make judgments. All of these things happen in the discussion itself. In other words, we don't identify a set of cognitive skills and say to the children, these are the skills you need to think well. We engage the children in thinking well, and in the process they learn the cognitive skills they need. So they learn it inconspicuously without having to pay attention to the mechanical process of learning the skills themselves. They just naturally pick it up. They naturally pick up good reasoning. And it's effortless. And it's a much more, I think, healthy way to learn than to isolate and alienate the skills, and then the children have the problem of asking themselves, when do I use these skills and when don't I? When do I apply them and when don't I? That makes the whole process of reasoning very artificial. Whereas if you just have the discussion of the concepts and the problems and just let it move where it wants to go, then it becomes a much more comfortable process.
How do you justify adding something more to the curriculum? Teachers are already overloaded with all the things that they have to teach, and now it seems that we want to add something more. How is that justified?
Well, you would only add something more to an overcrowded curriculum if it meant that it would help children organize their thinking much better, and it would help teachers be more efficient. So there are times when you add something, even when what you have is already more than what you would like, because I think it makes the overall result a better result. And in this particular case, what you're adding is an approach to education that makes children and teachers alike think in more general terms, to improve their ability to deal conceptually with the information that they're confronting. There are masses of information that teachers try to convey to children. If the children do not have concepts with which to package that information and to deal with it efficiently, then there's no good giving them the information. And it's just giving them too much to handle. So what you're doing is strengthening their capacity to deal with the information that they're getting. And you're strengthening the capacity of the teachers, too, to teach that information.
Teachers mentioned that they already strengthen judgment in their classrooms and they already teach for thinking.
Well, of course they do. And they are trained to do that, and they do it as well as they can given the kind of training they have. But first of all, there's a question whether they are given enough preparation in methods of helping children reason and helping them think and helping them make judgments. Can it be improved? And then we have to ask ourselves whether the kind of, the level of thinking that children engage in after going through our schools today, whether this level of thinking is adequate to the kinds of problems in life that they're going to face when they get out of school, and even the problems that they face while they're in school. And my guess is that it's not adequate. The existing teachers and the preparation they get are certainly there, but it is not sufficient to help these children with what they are dealing with.
Some of the people that work with children mentioned that children are natural philosophers. What do you think about this notion?
Well, I think that children naturally are curious. They are interested in language, just like philosophers. They are interested in problems of how we think about language and the world, just as philosophers are. But on the whole, I wouldn't want to say that they are natural philosophers. I mean, being a philosopher means being involved with a particular human discipline or educational discipline. And I don't think that children naturally are acquainted with that discipline. I think they become more proficient in philosophy when they are introduced to philosophy in a specific, deliberate way. For example, through a curriculum and through teachers trained to encourage philosophical thinking and through encounters with philosophical concepts. I think that you can encourage children to be philosophical, but I find it awkward to think of them as natural philosophers.
And what about self-esteem? Does this program promote self-esteem and independence in children?
Well, those are two things that are separate, but there are connections between them. Yes, if children are in the habit of being silent in class, not participating, because they feel that they cannot compete with those in the class who are in the front row with their hands up all the time, answering with the right answers and questions about arithmetic or geography or history. Then these other kids in the class more or less drop out, at least mentally. They are mental dropouts. And their self-esteem plummets downwards. And sometimes by the age of 8 or 9 or 10, they no longer have any interest in schooling. But if they can be involved, and in a way that philosophy does, where it's not a matter of competence in arithmetic or competence in science, but where they can feel that their personal experience will count for something, will be recognized and respected by the others in the class. They will eventually begin to hazard a comment, a suggestion, a proposal, and they find that they're being listened to. And this is almost intoxicating to them. They love being listened to by their classmates and to find that their classmates respect them. So being respected by others leads to improved self-respect. Being esteemed by one's classmates leads to improved self-esteem. And yes, at the same time, they find that they don't always have to agree with one another. They can disagree. They can take an independent point of view. They can say, well, in my opinion, that's not so, you see. And they give their reasons why. And this intellectual independence becomes a source of freedom for them. And it's a mark of creativity on their part, not to simply go along with whatever the group says. And this is terribly important also for their moral development, because they don't always have to submit to what their crowd or class or group tells them is the right thing. They can be independent when it seems to them appropriate to do so.
What you're saying seems to be very important for children, but isn't there a risk that this independence could become rebelliousness? Wouldn't they go home and try to be too independent for the ideas that are promoted at home?
Again, our experience is just the opposite. That if you improve the children's judgment in the school, in the classroom, then when they go home, they show more discretion than they would have before. They are more willing to discuss things with their parents rather than fight about them. They're more willing to deliberate over issues with their brothers and sisters than to engage in more violent behavior. So it's just the opposite, that if these ideas that they have bottled up inside of them can come out, then the repressed feelings can be siphoned off, and there's no longer that pressure for violent reactions. I think what you're saying could be applied also to democracy. I mean, you could say, well, if we open up the society to a point where we let people think for themselves and let them express their own views independently, isn't this going to lead to violence? Well, no, it leads away from violence. If you have freedom of expression in a society, then that's much more characteristic of a peaceful society than of a warlike society.
But what about the teachers? Do they need to be philosophers in order to work with the program?
Well, that's a very nice question. I think many teachers are apprehensive and anxious when they hear about philosophy because they think that they're going to have to take many years of study of ancient Greek writings in order to prepare themselves to teach children philosophy. And that's not really so. First of all, what we're doing is getting children not to learn philosophy in the sense of studying the history of philosophy. We're getting them to do philosophy. That's to engage in a kind of practice, a kind of deliberative inquiry, which philosophers do. And so the teachers are there to monitor and facilitate that kind of practice, not to have a certain kind of knowledge which they have to pass along to the children. As a result, the teachers can begin to teach children philosophy even without having had any formal courses in philosophy. They begin by practicing to do in their teacher education classrooms exactly what they will expect the children in their classrooms to do subsequently. And once they learn that practice, they can get children to engage in it, and they can monitor it and do what they can to improve it. But I think gradually teachers, or at least many of them, become interested in philosophy itself, in knowing more about philosophy. And they may want to go back and get further courses in traditional philosophy. When children are able to discuss abstract ideas. I think children not only are able, when they're very young, to discuss abstract ideas, but they have a definite need to do so. And if we prevent them from doing so by telling them, you can only discuss concrete subjects, you can only discuss practical, perceptual issues, don't try to deal with anything intellectual until you're 11 or 12, then we starve these children intellectually. And they become intellectually famished. And after a while, they can't eat at all because they're so hungry. And I think that we have to phase in the ideas. Now, when children are just able to talk, you will find that among the first things they say are accusations that the family is unfair to them, that their brothers and sisters are unfair, or that people are not treating them fairly when they go into a store and they get ahead of them and so forth. In other words, the concept of fairness comes almost immediately. And at the same time, the concept of truth is introduced very, very early. And it's introduced often by adults. Because the adults will say to a kid, but Johnny, is that true? You see, is what you're saying true? Now, truth is a very abstract notion. It's not like chair, you see. We can point to a chair and say, this is a chair, Johnny. But how do you point to truth and say, this is truth, Johnny? Now, the fact is that we hold children responsible for knowing the difference between truth and falsehood, even when they're very young. And we punish them if they tell us falsehoods when we expect truth from them. So it's not a question of having them wait until they're 11 or 12 to deal with the concept of truth. We expect them to be able and competent to deal with it almost immediately. The novel performs a very important role in that it provides the children with a model of how reasonable children might discuss philosophical issues. And, excuse me, children don't often have models of reasonable children. I mean, they see models of children on television or in storybooks, but these are often children who are very active, who engage in play and dramatic activities, but we very seldom see reflective children as examples for our own children. So the novels are necessary to give them a picture of the sort of thing we expect of them. Secondly, in addition to the novels, there are manuals that the teachers learn how to use. The manuals consist of exercises, activities, discussion plans, so that the teachers are not in a position where they always have to think up new activities, new games, new exercises. These are all worked out for them, and they are derived from the philosophical tradition. There is a long history of philosophers talking with one another about the problems that interest them. And to the extent to which you can reproduce these questions or these problems and phrase them in terms understandable by children, then you have a curriculum of perplexing issues that children would be interested in. For example, children are when they're very young, even before they can speak, they're interested in the difference between appearance and reality. There is the game that adults will play with children, peekaboo. First you see me, then you don't. This is a mystery. This is the reality, and so forth. And they laugh. The children laugh when this happens to them. Well, but philosophers are interested in exactly the same distinction. What is mere appearance and what is reality? Or is everything that is appearance also reality? Is there no distinction? And these are issues that children love to discuss among themselves. Is this a real elephant or a toy elephant?
On the basis of what you have mentioned before, what do you see as the goals of education, and what would be your conception of an educated person?
Well, I imagine an educated person to be a balanced person in which we find a balance between knowledge and understanding and application of the knowledge to life situations. It would also be a balance between the cognitive and the affective sides of the person. If I were to try to put all of that into a nutshell, I would say that the educated person should be a reasonable person. And there I'm emphasizing the person as well as the reasonableness. Because you don't just want a product of the educational process to be an informed nonentity. You want it to be a person of substance, a human being of substance. And that means that there be reasoning and judgment, not just the capacity to reason.
When you mention reasoning, do you mean the rationality, or what exactly do you mean by reasoning?
Well, thinking in accordance with established criteria, standards, principles, rules that have been worked out for thinking, that are thought of either formally or informally as logical. So that if we find people who are unbalanced, for example, they will often be self-destructive, and this is illogical to act in a way that is opposed to your own interests. Well, it's where we started. It's where I started, at any rate, around 11 to 12. And I thought that that was a good age because I was assured by the psychological literature that this is where children begin to be interested in the formal aspects of problems. And logic deals with the formal aspects of problems, so I thought, well, this would be a good time to introduce logic to children. But first of all, I found that they were interested in much more than just logic. They wanted the philosophy. They wanted the concepts in philosophy, concepts like truth and justice and what a person is and what friendship is. They wanted to talk about those concepts and not just talk logic. That was still too abstract for them. Then I discovered that other children of other ages would be interested too. And so later on, it was necessary to make other programs for older children. And eventually I came to the point where I realized that it was necessary to reach younger children than 11 or 12. And finally, to get down as low as kindergarten or first grade before starting it.
Dr. Sharp, could you tell us something about the international scene of the program?
Well, right now, I suppose there's close to 40 centers of philosophy for children in different countries in the world. Maybe as many as 30 countries in the world. And these centers, by and large, are associated with universities in their countries, and directed by men and women who have come to the IPC in New Jersey to be trained by us, and then have returned to their country to engage in teacher education, translation and adaptation of the materials, creation of new materials, and experimental research. Yes, we have, in 1985, the International Council for Philosophical Inquiry with Children was formed, and since that time we've been meeting once a year in different countries in the world. And that organization brings us all together, and itself has projects that we hope to see come to fruition in the very near future.
Like what kinds of projects?
Well, ICPIC would be very interested in setting some kind of standards for teacher education in philosophy for children. As we are growing in many countries, all sorts of situations arise of what constitutes adequate training in philosophy for children for in-service teachers and for prospective teachers. ICPIC would also like to create an international camp, maybe with 2 sites, one here in Iceland and one in Mexico in the very near future, where all children who study philosophy for children would be given the opportunity to come to one of these international camps for 2 to 4 weeks, to do philosophy with children from other nations, and to learn English. Looking at the relationship of those skills as we explore our world, the physical world. And we've been talking about the possibility of giving Icelandic children the opportunity to investigate the climate, the population, the animals in this country, the birds in this country. And to that extent, you find yourself thinking in environmental education.
Well, not only that, but our approach involves a study of relationships, getting children to understand what relationships are and how they work. And if you're going to get children to appreciate the relationship of human beings to their environment, then they have to see the relationship between population and agriculture, and the relationship between the weather and the industrial production, and so forth. They have to understand relationships in order to understand these larger problems. And if we don't give them preparation in understanding relationships, then just to tell them about these individual things is going to leave them very bewildered.
And how does philosophy provide this means to think in the disciplines?
Well, it's philosophy as we do it. That is to say, where we first dramatize the philosophy, presenting it in a fictional form, and showing them that knowledge and life are not alien to one another, but that talking about understanding of the world and the problems one faces in one's personal life is really important to education. It's essential to education that we show the relevance of that education to the world and to the other subjects that study the world. So philosophy has a way of getting you ready to do the other more specialized kinds of thinking.